The winter sun cast long shadows across Logan International Airport's exclusive terminal as the Richardson family made their way through the gleaming glass doors. They were dressed comfortably for their upcoming flight to the Bahamas. Mr. Richardson in his favorite navy sweater and jeans, Mrs. Richardson sporting a cozy cashmere pullover, and their two kids, aged 10 and 12, excited about their winter break adventure. As a top neurosurgeon at one of Boston's leading hospitals, Mr. Richardson had learned early in his career that flashy displays of wealth weren't his style. His wife, who had built a successful tech company from the ground up, shared his down-to-earth approach. Their children, despite growing up with privilege, were raised to value kindness and humility above all else. The family rolled their Louis Vuitton luggage quietly through the terminal, chatting about their planned activities in the Bahamas. The kids were especially thrilled about swimming with dolphins, while Mrs. Richardson was looking forward to finally finishing the novel she'd been trying to read for months. Mr. Richardson just smiled, happy to see his family excited about their first vacation in months. The private aviation lounge was relatively quiet that morning, with just a few other travelers scattered around the plush seating area. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the complimentary beverage station, where their daughter headed to grab a hot chocolate. Their son remained glued to his Nintendo Switch, perfecting his Mario Kart skills, while perched on one of the elegant leather armchairs. The family had done this routine dozens of times before: check in, relax in the lounge, then board their private jet for whatever destination awaited them. It was just another Thursday for them, nothing out of the ordinary. The staff at the terminal knew them well, though the Richardsons never made a big deal about their status as regular private jet clients. Mrs. Richardson was just helping herself to a glass of water when she noticed an impeccably dressed woman giving them strange looks from across the room. The woman's designer suit and perfectly coiffed hair screamed old money, and her expression grew increasingly confused and agitated as she watched the Richardson family settle into their usual spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The kids were oblivious to the scrutiny, caught up in their own activities. Mr. Richardson was on a brief call with his hospital, discussing last-minute details about his patient's care during his absence. None of them noticed when the woman began whispering to other passengers, gesturing in their direction with poorly concealed disdain. The family's peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn, but for now, they remained in their bubble of pre-vacation joy. Mrs. Richardson checked their flight details one last time on her phone, while their daughter returned with her hot chocolate, careful not to spill it on her favorite travel outfit. The terminal's sophisticated lighting system adjusted automatically as clouds passed overhead, creating a calm and luxurious atmosphere. The Richardsons' carry-on bags sat neatly beside them, containing their essential items and a few comfort necessities for the 3-hour flight to paradise. The sound of clicking heels on the polished floor grew louder, but the family remained absorbed in their own world, unaware that their ordinary morning was about to become anything but typical. The woman in the designer suit had made up her mind about something, and her determined stride toward the front desk suggested that the peaceful atmosphere in the exclusive terminal was about to change dramatically. Little did anyone know that the next few minutes would spark a viral moment that would have people across the country talking about prejudice, privilege, and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. For now, though, the Richardson family simply waited for their flight, just like any other day at the private terminal, at least for the next few moments. The peaceful morning atmosphere in the private terminal shattered as Mrs. Blackwood, as she'd later identify herself, marched toward the front desk, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to chaos. Her pearl necklace bounced slightly with each determined step, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her crocodile skin handbag as if it were armor. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for half the terminal to hear, "but I believe there's been some sort of security breach." Her voice dripped with the kind of manufactured concern that barely masked her true intentions. The young desk attendant, Alex, looked up from their computer screen with professional curiosity. Mrs. Blackwood leaned in, dropping her voice to what she probably thought was a whisper, but was still clearly audible to nearby passengers. "Those people over there," she gestured with a slight tilt of her head toward the Richardson family, "I don't believe they belong in this terminal. This is a private aviation lounge, you know." Alex, who had welcomed the Richardson family countless times over the past 3 years, blinked in momentary confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not quite sure what you mean. All our guests have been properly checked in." But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't satisfied. She straightened her designer blazer and spoke even louder, clearly wanting to draw attention to what she perceived as a pressing issue. "Well, they certainly don't look like they belong here. I mean, look at how they're dressed, and those children playing games. This isn't some public airport food court." The Richardson children, still blissfully unaware of the brewing storm, continued with their activities. Their daughter was now sharing funny videos with her brother, both giggling quietly over the Nintendo Switch. Mrs. Richardson had picked up a magazine and was flipping through it, while Mr. Richardson checked some work emails on his phone. Other passengers in the lounge began to take notice of the scene unfolding at the desk. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones, though their eyes kept darting between Mrs. Blackwood and the Richardson family. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something newsworthy was about to unfold. "Ma'am," Alex tried again, maintaining remarkable composure, "I can assure you that all our guests are verified before entering the terminal. Now, is there something I can help you with regarding your own flight today?" But Mrs. Blackwood was on a mission. Her voice rose another notch as she demanded, "I want to speak to your supervisor. This is unacceptable. I pay far too much money for my membership here to feel uncomfortable in my own terminal." The word uncomfortable hung in the air like a toxic cloud. A few nearby passengers exchanged knowing looks, some shaking their heads in disapproval, though it wasn't clear whether their disapproval was directed at Mrs. Blackwood or the situation in general. Finally, the commotion caught Mrs. Richardson's attention. She looked up from her magazine, her expression shifting from relaxed to concerned as she realized the woman at the desk kept pointing in their direction. Mr. Richardson, still focused on his phone, hadn't noticed yet, but their daughter had stopped showing videos to her brother and was now watching the scene with growing unease. The terminal's peaceful atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by a thick tension that seemed to grow with each passing moment. Even the soft background music seemed to fade away, overwhelmed by Mrs. Blackwood's increasingly agitated demands for security to be called. Alex remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, if you'd like to discuss this privately, we can step into the office. However, I want to be very clear that all our guests are valued members of our private aviation community." Mrs. Blackwood's face flushed red with indignation. She opened her designer handbag, pulled out a membership card, and slapped it on the counter. "Do you see this? Platinum member for 15 years. I think I know who belongs here and who doesn't." Little did she know, her platinum membership was about to seem far less impressive compared to what was coming next. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, about to tip into territory that would make her wish she'd never opened her mouth in the first place. The situation in the private terminal reached a boiling point as Mrs. Blackwood, now fully committed to her misguided crusade, pulled out her phone and began recording. "I'm documenting this entire security breach," she announced to no one in particular, her phone pointed directly at the Richardson family. "This is completely unacceptable." Mr. Richardson finally looked up from his phone, his peaceful expression turning to concern as he realized what was happening. He gently touched his wife's arm and whispered something in her ear. Their children, sensing the growing tension, moved closer to their parents. The daughter slipped her hand into her mother's, while their son put his game down for the first time since arriving. Other passengers in the terminal had given up pretending not to watch. Several had their phones out, but unlike Mrs. Blackwood, they were filming her behavior, not the Richardson family. A gentleman in a business suit shook his head and muttered, "Not again. When will people learn?" Alex, the desk attendant, had quietly pressed the security button under the counter while trying to reason with Mrs. Blackwood. "Ma'am, please stop recording other guests. That's against our privacy policy, and I'll have to ask you to delete that footage." "Delete it? Absolutely not." Mrs. Blackwood's voice reached a new pitch. "I pay $50,000 a year for my membership, and I demand to know how these people got in here." She emphasized "these people" in a way that made several nearby passengers wince. Mrs. Richardson stood up slowly, her dignity intact despite the humiliation being thrust upon her family. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm, "but you're frightening our children." If you have concerns, I suggest you discuss them with management privately. This direct confrontation seemed to fuel Mrs. Blackwood's misplaced confidence even more. Oh, now you speak up. Well, let's talk about how you got past security. Did someone leave a door unlocked? Did you sneak in behind a real member? A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, their expressions a mix of disgust at Mrs. Blackwood's behavior and sympathy for the Richardson family. An elderly woman approached the Richardsons and stood beside them in a silent show of support. Mr. Richardson finally stood up, his tall frame carrying an air of quiet authority. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by Mrs. Blackwood's continued tirade. "Security? Where is security?" she demanded, looking around frantically. "I want these people removed immediately. This is a private terminal, not a public waiting area." The atmosphere in the terminal had become so tense you could hear a pin drop. Even the coffee machine's gentle hum seemed too loud in the charged air. The Richardson children huddled closer to their mother, their excitement about the upcoming vacation completely forgotten. Another passenger, a well-dressed businessman, approached Alex at the desk. "I'd like to file a complaint about this woman's behavior," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is harassment, plain and simple." Mrs. Blackwood spun around to face him. "How dare you? I'm protecting our exclusive space. Do you have any idea who I am? My husband's company has 3 private jets." Just then, the terminal's glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh. 2 security officers walked in, followed by the head of terminal operations. The head of operations, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, took in the scene before him with a single glance. What happened next would soon become a viral sensation, shared millions of times across social media platforms. The security team's approach was measured and professional, but they weren't heading toward the Richardson family as Mrs. Blackwood had expected. Instead, they moved purposefully in her direction. The head of operations caught sight of Mr. Richardson and nodded respectfully. "Good morning, sir. Is everything all right here?" he asked, completely ignoring Mrs. Blackwood's attempts to get his attention. The look of confusion that crossed Mrs. Blackwood's face was just the beginning. She was about to learn a very public lesson about making assumptions, and her world of privilege was about to be turned upside down in the most unexpected way. The head of terminal operations, Mr. Thompson, walked past Mrs. Blackwood as if she were invisible, making his way directly to the Richardson family. "I apologize for this disturbance," he said warmly. "Dr. Richardson, we've known each other for 7 years now?" Mrs. Blackwood's jaw dropped slightly, her phone lowering just a fraction as confusion crept across her face. But she quickly recovered, stepping forward with her membership card thrust out like a shield. "Excuse me. I'm the one who called about the security breach. These people—" "Ma'am," one of the security officers cut in firmly, "please lower your voice and put your phone away. Recording other passengers is strictly against terminal policy." The second security officer moved between Mrs. Blackwood and the Richardson family, his stance protective rather than threatening. "Mr. Thompson, would you like us to escort this lady to the office to discuss her disruptive behavior?" The other passengers in the terminal had given up any pretense of not watching. Some were openly recording the scene now, their phones capturing every moment of Mrs. Blackwood's impending realization. The elderly woman who had stood by the Richardsons earlier couldn't hide her smile. "Actually," Mr. Thompson said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dr. Richardson's family has been one of our most valued clients since they purchased their first Gulfstream. The terminal staff considers them family at this point." Mrs. Blackwood's face went through a fascinating range of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then the slow dawn of horror as understanding began to sink in. Her designer handbag slipped from her grip, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. The Richardson children, sensing the shift in power, began to relax slightly. Their daughter even managed a small smile as she watched the woman who had caused such a scene trying to process this new information. "Perhaps, ma'am," Mr. Thompson continued, now addressing Mrs. Blackwood directly, "you're unaware that Dr. Richardson is not only one of Boston's top neurosurgeons, but also serves on the board of 3 major hospitals. And Mrs. Richardson's tech company has revolutionized patient care systems across the country." A young man in the corner of the terminal whispered loudly to his companion, "Oh man, this is going viral for sure." His prediction would prove more accurate than he knew. Mrs. Blackwood's face had turned an interesting shade of red, but Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. Their private jet, by the way, is the new G650, one of the most advanced private aircraft in our terminal. I believe you mentioned something about 3 jets. The Richardson family actually decided one was enough. They prefer to donate to charitable causes rather than maintain an unnecessary fleet. The terminal had fallen so quiet you could hear the ice shifting in water glasses. Every eye was on Mrs. Blackwood, waiting to see how she would handle this dramatic turn of events. I didn't, she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Her phone had disappeared into her pocket, and she was now frantically searching for her dropped handbag, seemingly desperate for something to do with her hands. We value all our clients here, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice taking on an educational tone, but the Richardsons have earned special respect not just for their success, but for their humility and kindness to our staff. Something we unfortunately haven't witnessed from everyone today. One of the security officers bent down and retrieved Mrs. Blackwood's handbag, holding it out to her with professional courtesy. Ma'am, if you'll come with us, we need to discuss terminal policies regarding harassment and unauthorized recording of other passengers. The Richardson family maintained their dignity throughout the entire scene, neither gloating nor showing anger. Mr. Richardson simply nodded to Mr. Thompson and said quietly, "Thank you for handling this so professionally. We appreciate it." Just then, the terminal doors opened again and a flight crew walked in. The captain, spotting the Richardsons, broke into a warm smile and headed their way. Mrs. Blackwood's education in making assumptions was about to continue, and the next few moments would provide even more material for the viral video that was already being uploaded to multiple social media platforms. The flight crew's arrival added another layer to the already dramatic scene unfolding in the private terminal. The captain, a veteran pilot with salt and pepper hair, walked directly to the Richardson family with the familiarity of an old friend. "Good morning. Ready for another smooth flight to the Bahamas?" Mrs. Blackwood, who was still trying to process the earlier revelations, watched in stunned silence as the entire flight crew greeted the family by name. The first officer even high-fived the Richardson children, asking them if they'd brought their favorite card game for the flight. "We've got the cabin set up just the way you like it," the flight attendant added cheerfully. "And yes, we remembered the special hot chocolate for the kids." She turned to Mrs. Richardson with a warm smile. "We also stocked that particular spring water you enjoy." The personal touches and familiar interaction between the flight crew and the Richardson family painted a clear picture. This wasn't just a family that could afford private air travel. They were respected regulars who treated everyone, from the cleaning staff to the pilots, with genuine kindness. Meanwhile, the security officers were still waiting to escort Mrs. Blackwood to the office. She seemed rooted to the spot, watching as more terminal staff appeared to greet the Richardsons. A ground crew member walked in with a tablet, approaching Mr. Richardson. "Sir, I've updated the flight plan as requested. We've arranged for the car service to meet you at the FBO in the Bahamas." One of the terminal's maintenance workers passing by called out, "Hey Doc, thanks again for that medical advice last month. My mom's doing much better now." Mr. Richardson responded with a genuine smile and asked about specific details of his mother's recovery, showing he actually remembered the conversation. The other passengers in the terminal, still recording everything on their phones, were treated to quite a show. Here was a wealthy family who didn't just have money, they had something Mrs. Blackwood's behavior showed she clearly lacked: class and genuine human connection. "Your Gulfstream is ready for boarding whenever you are," the captain announced. "Weather looks perfect all the way to the islands." He gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where, in clear view, sat one of the most luxurious private jets in the world, its polished exterior gleaming in the morning sun. Mrs. Blackwood's face had lost all its earlier self-righteous color. Her eyes were fixed on the magnificent aircraft that was apparently waiting for the family she had just tried to have removed from the terminal. The word "Umhumier," clearly visible on the boarding documents the captain was holding, didn't help her situation. One of the younger terminal staff couldn't resist adding, "They've had that jet for about 2 years now. Upgraded from their previous one so they could fly direct to Europe for their medical charity missions." He said this loudly enough for everyone to hear, though he pretended to be speaking just to his colleague. The Richardson children had finally relaxed completely, back to their excited vacation mode. Their daughter was showing the flight attendant some pictures on her phone, while their son was eagerly discussing the flight path with the first officer, who was patiently explaining how they would navigate around some weather systems. Mr. Thompson turned back to Mrs. Blackwood, his voice professional but firm. "Now then, about those terminal policies we need to discuss." He gestured toward his office, making it clear this wasn't a request. The elderly woman who had stood by the Richardsons earlier spoke up, her voice carrying clearly across the terminal. "You know, dear," she addressed Mrs. Blackwood, "I've been flying private for 30 years, and I've learned that real class has nothing to do with how much money you have or how many jets you own. It's about how you treat people." Several passengers nodded in agreement, while others continued recording what was quickly becoming a viral lesson in humility and prejudice. The contrast between the Richardsons' quiet dignity and Mrs. Blackwood's misplaced arrogance couldn't have been clearer. As the family began gathering their belongings to head toward their jet, Mrs. Richardson paused and did something unexpected. She turned to Mrs. Blackwood and said softly, "I hope you have a good day, ma'am. And I truly hope you'll think about this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances." The simple gesture of grace in the face of prejudice left many onlookers misty-eyed and would later become one of the most commented on aspects of the viral videos that were already being uploaded to social media platforms across the globe. Within hours of the incident at the private terminal, social media was buzzing with multiple angles of the confrontation. The videos spread like wildfire across platforms, with hashtags like #PrivateJetKaren and #Don'tJudgeBeLooks trending nationwide. Each new share brought fresh waves of comments and discussions about prejudice, privilege, and the dangers of making assumptions. The young man who had predicted the incident would go viral turned out to be a popular content creator. His well-edited version of events, posted with the caption "Watch till the end, the twist is gold," had already reached millions of views by sunset. The comment section was flooded with reactions, ranging from anger at Mrs. Blackwood's behavior to admiration for the Richardson family's grace under pressure. "The way they handled it, pure class," read one top comment with over 50,000 likes. Another viral comment pointed out, "Notice how the family never once bragged about their wealth or status until forced to reveal it. That's real dignity right there." News organizations picked up the story by early afternoon. Local Boston stations sent reporters to the airport, hoping to catch interviews with terminal staff. Mr. Thompson, the head of terminal operations, kept his comments professional. "We pride ourselves on providing excellent service to all our clients, and we have zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior of any kind." The elderly woman who had stood by the Richardson family became something of a social media hero herself. Her quote about real class being about how you treat people was already being printed on T-shirts by enterprising online merchants. Someone had dubbed her Wise Airport Lady, and fan accounts were popping up in her honor. Back in the terminal, Mrs. Blackwood's meeting with airport management lasted over an hour. Through the office's glass walls, other passengers could see her repeatedly dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. When she finally emerged, her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, and her designer outfit seemed to have lost its air of superiority. Security escorted her to the main terminal, where she would have to book a commercial flight. Her private aviation membership had been suspended pending review. As she walked past the window, she caught a glimpse of the Richardsons' Gulfstream taking off, climbing gracefully into the blue sky on its way to the Bahamas. Several passengers who had witnessed the incident shared their perspectives online. One business executive wrote a lengthy LinkedIn post about checking your biases and the true meaning of professional conduct. Another passenger's TikTok video, which captured Mrs. Blackwood's face when she realized who the Richardsons were, had been remixed into countless memes. The terminal staff were being praised in comment sections for their professional handling of the situation. The young desk attendant, Alex, had been specifically mentioned in many posts for maintaining composure throughout the confrontation. "Give that employee a raise" became a common replay under the viral videos. Private aviation forums were abuzz with discussions about the Richardsons' reputation in the industry. Pilots and crew members from other airports began sharing stories about the family's kindness and humility. One ground crew member wrote about how Dr. Richardson had helped his sick child get specialized care, while another mentioned Mrs. Richardson's habit of bringing holiday gifts for every staff member. By evening, social media analysts estimated that the various videos of the incident had collectively received over 50 million views across platforms. News websites were publishing articles with titles like "Private Jet Karen Gets Schooled in Assumptions" and "Viral Airport Incident Sparks National Conversation." The memes were endless. Screenshots of Mrs. Blackwood's shocked face when the pilot greeted the family the moment she realized they owned the Gulfstream, and particularly popular, the image of her designer handbag dropping to the floor in shock, paired with clever captions about karma and assumptions. But perhaps the most impactful posts were the thoughtful discussions emerging about everyday prejudices and the way people judge others based on appearance. Social media users began sharing their own stories of being underestimated or discriminated against, creating a ripple effect of awareness and reflection. As night fell, the incident had become more than just a viral moment. It was sparking genuine conversations about privilege, prejudice, and the true nature of class. And somewhere over the Atlantic, unaware of their growing internet fame, the Richardson family was simply enjoying their vacation flight, having chosen to rise above the drama with the same quiet dignity that had made their response so powerful in the first place. In the days following the airport incident, the story evolved from viral entertainment into something far more meaningful. Major news networks picked up the story, using it as a springboard to discuss deeper issues of prejudice in everyday life. The Richardson family, who had initially wanted to avoid the spotlight, realized their experience could help create positive change. 1 week after the incident, Dr. Richardson appeared on a morning news show via video call from their Bahamas vacation. He spoke thoughtfully about the experience. "What happened to us that day happens to countless people every day. The only difference is that we had the privilege of a dramatic reveal. Most people who face prejudice don't get that moment of vindication." His words struck a chord nationwide. The interview clip was shared millions of times, with people adding their own stories of being judged based on appearance. Teachers began using the incident as a classroom discussion topic, helping students understand the impact of unconscious bias. Mrs. Richardson's tech company released a powerful statement about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She announced a new scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in technology and medicine, turning the negative experience into an opportunity to create positive change. The private terminal implemented new anti-discrimination training for all members, using the incident as a case study. Mr. Thompson, the terminal manager, worked with diversity experts to develop guidelines that would help prevent similar situations in the future. "We want to ensure that every person who walks through our doors feels respected," he explained in a press statement. Even the Richardson children made an impact. Their son wrote a school essay about the experience that went viral after his teacher shared it with permission. "My parents taught me that how much money you have doesn't matter as much as how you treat people," he wrote. That day at the airport proved they were right. Mrs. Blackwood, after days of social media backlash, made a public apology that seemed genuinely heartfelt. "I've had to take a hard look at my own prejudices," she admitted in a written statement. "I'm not proud of my behavior, but I'm committed to learning from this experience." She announced she would be joining a diversity and inclusion board at her local community center. The elderly woman who had stood by the Richardsons, now known affectionately across social media as Airport Grandma, used her unexpected platform to speak about witnessing 7 decades of social change. "But we still have work to do," she reminded everyone in a follow-up interview. "Change happens one person, one moment at a time." Corporations began using the incident in their training programs. Human resource departments across the country incorporated the story into their workshops about workplace bias. One major company even created a training video recreating the scene, titled "Check Your Assumptions at the Door." The aviation industry took notice too. Several private jet companies launched campaigns promoting respect and inclusion. The hashtag #FlyWithRespect started trending as other travelers shared stories of facing prejudice at airports around the world. 3 months after the incident, the Richardsons were invited to give a keynote speech at a national conference on diversity and inclusion. They spoke about turning moments of discrimination into opportunities for education. "We could have responded with anger," Mrs. Richardson said, "but we chose to make this a teaching moment instead." Their story became part of a larger conversation about privilege and prejudice in America. Social scientists cited the incident in papers about modern discrimination, noting how social media had transformed one airport confrontation into a national teaching moment. The Richardson children's perspective remained refreshingly pure. When asked about the incident by a kids' news program, their daughter simply said, "I just wish people would be nice to each other. It's not that hard." Her comment became one of the most shared quotes from the entire story. 1 year later, the video of the incident was still being used in schools and corporate training sessions. But more importantly, people reported thinking twice before making snap judgments about others. As one viral tweet put it, "Ever since the private jet incident, I catch myself when I'm about to make assumptions about people. You never know someone's story." The lasting impact wasn't just about viral fame or social media buzz, it was about genuine change in how people think about and treat each other. The Richardsons had shown that responding to prejudice with dignity and grace could be more powerful than any angry confrontation.